Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the new 65-watt Ryzen 7000 series of processors from AMD. So the new non-X Zen 4 parts, let's say. And I'm sure many of you are aware, AMD did first introduce the Ryzen 7000 series back in September of last year, so about 4 months ago now. And despite being very impressive in terms of performance, many of you faced pretty steep costs if you were to migrate to a new AM5 processor because you needed DDR5 memory, an expensive AM5 motherboard, and for that reason, many of you just didn't. As a result, AMD's been quite aggressive with price cuts for the 7600X, 7700X, 7900X, and 7950X over the past few months, and while that has helped, it's only addressed part of the pricing problem as AM5 motherboards and DDR5 memory have been slow to come down in price. For example, today a bare bones B650 motherboard will still set you back $160 US, with very basic X670 boards starting at an absurd $260. Then you're looking at around $150 US for a 32GB kit of DDR5 6000 memory, and the low latency CL30 stuff we use to showcase Zen 4 performance, that costs $180 US. In short, gamers after something like the Ryzen 7 7700X will need to part with $350 just for the processor, then at least $160 for a motherboard, and $150 for memory, so about a $660 platform upgrade for an AM4 owner. But even for new system builders, you can purchase the Ryzen 7 5700X for $200, a decent B550 motherboard for around $120, and a 32GB kit of DDR4 3600CL16 memory for $110, so a $430 combo that in many gaming scenarios it's really not a great deal slower. So I guess the question is, can AMD entice more people to the AM5 platform with these cheaper non-X models? Well, before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their NVIDIA GeForce RTX 30 series of graphics cards. For gamers seeking a premium experience, the Aorus range offers a number of excellent models such as the Extreme, Master, and Waterforce. All models include high-end coolers, either with massive triple fan heatsinks or large radiators in the case of the Waterforce series. These aggressive performance-focused designs ensure optimal operating temperatures and maximum power delivery. They're also very eye-catching with stunning RGB visual effects, and of course with the ability to support ray tracing and DLSS, you can enjoy breathtaking in-game visuals. For our Aussie viewers, these models are also available in pre-built systems from M-Wave, PLE, Scorptech, and Senecom, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so at the bottom of the stack, we now have the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 7600, which will be coming in at an MSRP of $230 US, and it clocks to 5.1 GHz, so 4% lower than that of the 7600X, and out of the box it does adhere to the 65-watt TDP. Other than that though, it is basically the same part as the 7600X, and of course it's unlocked, so you could achieve 7600X-like performance via overclocking if you so wished. Unlike the 7600X though, the 7600 does come with a box cooler. It's only the low-profile Wraith Stealth, but it does work, and it will save you some money on having to buy, well, another cooler. There's also the 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 7700 coming in at $330 US, and again, this is a 65-watt part, though it can clock as high as 5.3 GHz. This model also comes with the Wraith Prism cooler, which is actually quite a decent quality cooler, especially given that it is a box cooler, so that's quite a good deal. Then we have the $430 US 12-core 24-thread Ryzen 9 7900, which can clock as high as 5.4 GHz out of the box. This is again a 65-watt part, and this model also comes with the Wraith Prism box cooler. Now, when compared to current Ryzen 7000 series pricing, we find that the MSRP for the 7600 makes it just $20 cheaper than the lowest 7600X price available right now at $250, though most of the listings are heading back up around $300. So it would seem as though those temporary Zen 4 price cuts are over at this point, and replacing them will be these new non-X models, which I guess makes sense. Now, the lowest price the 7600X has hit over the past few months is about $240. So with the 7600X coming in at $230 with a cooler, it is the best Zen 4 deal that we've seen yet, at least, well, the most affordable Zen 4 deal, let's say. Now, the 7700X, which was introduced at an MSRP of $400, was selling as low as $330, and right now can be had for $350. Therefore, the 7700, which is set to cost $330, will enter the market around $20 cheaper than the cheapest X version, but you also get a quality box cooler, so that is a nice bonus. Then we have the 7900X, which landed with an MSRP of $550, but late last year had dropped as low as $440, but at present is back up around $480. So the non-X model is quite an improvement at $430, and again it does have the Wraith Prism box cooler. So essentially these new non-X models will allow us to officially re-review Zen 4 at a more affordable price point with slightly better motherboard and memory prices, so it'll be interesting to see how they stack up. Now, normally I have quite a few application and gaming benchmarks for you, but as you're about to see, in terms of performance, there's generally very little difference between these non-X and X models. So rather than spend 20 minutes or so going over dozens upon dozens of graphs, I'll speed up the process by reducing the number of applications we're going to look at, while skipping most of the individual game results for the 10-game average. As for testing, I'll be using the GeForce RTX 4090, Windows 11, and resizable bar was enabled for all test configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Actually, before we get into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at the all-core behavior in Cinebench R23, starting with the 7600. By default, it runs at a core power of 65 watts with a package power of 90 watts, and this allows for a typical all-core clock frequency of 4,920 MHz. Using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, saw a peak die temperature of 78 degrees. Now, with AMD's one-click auto OC or PBO option, the typical operating frequency for this workload only jumped up to 4,995 MHz, and that's a mere 75 MHz bump. This did, however, increase the core power to 75 watts and the package power to 102 watts for a peak operating temperature of 83 degrees. Now, compare that to the 7600X, which sustained an all-core frequency of 5,240 MHz, just 7% higher than that of the non-X part. This pushed core power to 85 watts and package power to 115 watts for an operating temperature of 89 degrees. Next, we have the Ryzen 7 7700, and this model runs at 4,880 MHz out of the box for this particular workload, resulting in a package power of 90 watts and an operating temperature of 67 degrees. Then with PBO enabled, the frequency jumped up by 3.5% to 5,050 MHz, and this modest frequency gain increased power usage by a massive 39% to 125 watts, which also drastically increased the operating temperature to 87 degrees. Still, that's quite tame when compared to the 7700X, which clocks just 5% higher than the stock 7700 for an almost 60% increase in power usage, hitting 98 degrees. Then we have the 7900, which operates its 12 cores at an average frequency of 4,415 MHz, and this was possible at a package power of just 90 watts, resulting in a peak operating temperature of just 70 degrees. Enabling PBO boosted the operating frequency by 14% to 5,050 MHz, but it also increased the power usage by 91% to 172 watts, resulting in a 92 degree operating temperature. Finally, the 7900X ran at 5,200 MHz, 186 watts for the package power, and 95 degrees for the peak operating temperature. And here are the Cinebench R23 results, which confirm everything we just learnt about the operating behavior of these CPUs in this workload. The 7600 scored 14,344 points, and enabling PBO boosted that score by a mere 1.5%. Meanwhile, out of the box, the 7600 was just 4% slower than the 7600X. The 7700 scored 18,337 points, and here PBO was more useful, improving performance by 7% to get within a few percent of the 7700X. Then the 7900 scored 25,062 points, making it quite a bit slower than the 7900X, though that margin was largely closed down simply by enabling PBO, making what is essentially a more efficient version of the 7900X. Looking at the single-core performance, we find that the 7600X is 5% faster than the 7600, the 7700X is just 3% faster than the 7700, and the 7900X is 4% faster than the 7900. So the margins here are fairly similar, between 3 to 5% faster for those original X models, so really not a big difference here, and in most instances PBO does a good job of closing that already small gap. Now, I'm not going to go over all the individual results for the 7-zip file manager test, rather I'll just show you the compression and decompression performance, but In short, the margins are similar to what we saw in Cinebench R23, and that is to say the 7600 was typically just 3% slower than the 7600X. The same was also true of the 7700 versus the 7700X, while the 7900 was up to 8% slower than the 7900X. Adobe Photoshop 2022 generally only uses 1 to 2 cores, so this is more of a single core benchmark, and as such, we're seeing very little difference between the X and non-X CPUs here, around a 3% margin. And the last application we're going to look at is Blender, and again, these results are very similar to what was shown in Cinebench R23. The 7600X was 5% faster than the 7600, the 7700X 4% faster than the 7700, and the 7900X 12% faster than the 7900. Now here's a look at total system power consumption. From the 7600 to the 7600X, we're looking at a 12% increase in total system consumption, and that's for a few percent extra performance, making the non-X model the more efficient product. Then from the 7700 to the 7700X, that sees a 21% increase in system consumption for, again, what amounts to just 4% more performance in this example. Then we have the 7900, which thanks to its higher core count can afford to run those cores at a much lower frequency, allowing for lower voltages, and it can do this while still achieving excellent productivity performance. And as a result, it consumed the same amount of power as the 7600, but incredibly was 83% faster in this example. It also meant, when compared to the 7900X, that the 7900 is far better when it comes to power efficiency. The 7900X, for example, pushed total system usage 50% higher for a mere 12% more performance. Okay, time for the gaming benchmarks, and again, we're going to look at the graph for 3 of the 10 games tested. The results are all very predictable. Starting with Hitman 3 at 1080p, we see that the 7600 is just 3 FPS slower than the 7600X, the 7700 just 4 FPS slower than the 7700X, and the 7900 10 FPS slower than the 7900X. It's a similar story at 1440p, so really it's only this 7900X that offers a noticeable performance gain over its non-X part, and even here we're only talking about a 4% increase. The Horizon Zero Dawn performance is even closer between the X and non-X models. The 7900 and 7900X delivered identical performance, while the 7600X was 1% faster than the 7600. It's the same story at 1440p, so at least in this example, it doesn't really matter which model you use, the performance is going to be much the same. Cyberpunk 2077 is very CPU demanding and therefore utilizes these parts well. It's also sensitive to frequency, so we are seeing some variation in the results here. That said, the 7900 versus 7900X battle, which sees the largest difference in operating behavior, only resulted in a 7% performance variation in this game. The margin is reduced to just 3% for the 7700 versus 7700X matchup, and 5% for the 7600 versus the 7600X, and it's a similar story at 1440p. And here it is, the 10-game average, starting with the 1080p data. The 7600 was on average just 4% slower than the 7600X, the 7700 just 5% slower than the 7700X, and the 7900 just 4% slower than the 7900X. Now, these aren't big margins, and for those who care about productivity performance, we'll find these non-X CPUs to make a lot more sense, given they're significantly more efficient and operate at much lower temperatures. But you can also see why AMD went about things the way they did. These non-X parts don't look nearly as impressive on a graph when compared to Intel's 13th gen range. The 7700X, for example, is just a few frames slower than the 13900K, and that sees it take second spot. The 7700 though, which is just a few percent slower, is more of a midfield contender in this graph, trailing the 13700K by a slim margin. Now, as you'd expect at the slightly more GPU-bound 1440p resolution, and I do only mean slightly more GPU-bound, the margins closed up a little. Here the 7700 is now 4% slower than the 7700X, so just a 1% decrease there compared to what we saw at 1080p. Overall, the non-X parts are at most 4% slower here. Now for a look at cooling performance using the supplied box cooler, and we'll start with the 7600 using the Wraith Stealth. When placed under an all-core workload in Cinebench for an hour, installed inside an ATX case with a room temperature of 21 degrees, this combo peaked at 97 degrees, so very hot. That said, we know Zen 4 processors target a 95-degree TJ max and are designed to do so, at least according to AMD. And we saw no evidence of throttling under these test conditions, so the 7600 performed as expected, and for reference, under the exact same test conditions, the 7600 peaked at 78 degrees with a 360mm AIO. Next, we have the 7700 with the Wraith Prism, which is a far more impressive cooler, and the results here are far better than what we saw with the 7600/Stealth combo. With the Prism, the 7700 peaked at 79 degrees, so well below the 95-degree TJ max. That's a pretty great result given that a 360mm AIO saw a peak temperature of 73 degrees. Then finally, we have the 7900, which again comes with the Wraith Prism. This time we again saw a peak temperature of 79 degrees, so another great result. And for reference, the 7900 peaked at 70 degrees using a 360mm liquid cooler. Okay, so AMD's new non-X Zen 4 CPU is a lot like their non-X Zen 3 CPUs, which were a lot like the non-X Zen 2 CPUs, which were a lot like... I guess I'll stop there, we could go on for a bit further, but I think the point is that they're pretty much exactly what you would have been expecting, a cheaper and ever so slightly slower version of the X counterpart. Basically, in the past, I've always recommended you buy the cheaper non-X version, and I've done this for a few reasons. Firstly, they are generally cheaper and deliver comparable performance. They're more efficient. They're also unlocked, so you can just overclock them to achieve full performance anyway, and they typically come with a box cooler, which you can sell on eBay if you don't need it. The Wraith Prism, for example, that generally sells for like $30 to $40 US, which is pretty crazy given you can get a really good quality tower style cooler for that price. So I'd say, assuming that the non-X parts are at least $20 US cheaper, I'd probably go that way, sell the cooler and pocket the difference. I'm also a lot happier with how these non-X models behave out of the box. They're significantly more efficient, and if you want to overclock them for maximum performance, so power efficiency be damned, well, you can still do that. Now, I thought we might as well create an updated cost per frame analysis for this content, so let's go do that. Before I do though, a bucket list of disclaimers. Firstly, the angle here is for new system builders or those upgrading the entire platform. So not someone who's already well invested in a relatively modern or current generation platform such as AM4 or LGA 1700. If already on AM4, you'd probably just opt for a 5700X or 5800X 3D. And if on LGA 1700 with a lower end 12th gen part, you'd probably just look at getting a 13th gen upgrade. So for this cost per frame analysis, I will be including the current retail price of the CPU, a 32GB kit of memory, and a budget motherboard, since most of you seem to like min-maxing your motherboard and CPU, which I get. Now, because this is a new system build / complete platform upgrade value analysis, we're focusing exclusively on DDR5 memory for platforms that support it. For budget builds, DDR4 still has its place, but that's not what we're looking at today. Having said all of that though, the AM4 CPUs were obviously tested with DDR4 memory as they don't support DDR5, and here I'll be using DDR4 3600CL16 memory, which is available for $110 US in a 32GB kit. Though this will be a little bit slower than the CL14 memory that I used for our testing. And you could also save even more money on a CL18 kit, they're about $80 US, but that is quite a bit slower than what we tested with and would really throw off the numbers. Given that the AM4 CPUs are getting slightly slower and much cheaper DDR4 memory for this value analysis compared to what we actually tested with, I'm going to do the same with the DDR5 configurations, opting for $150 US DDR5 6000 memory, and I've also given the Raptor Lake CPUs the same price, despite the cheapest DDR5 6400 memory coming in at $175 US. I would expect to see a similar performance decline for Zen 4 and Raptor Lake CPUs using the DDR5 6000 CL36 memory compared to what is shown in the video. And if that doesn't sound fair, please do keep in mind that the DDR5 memory used to test the AMD and Intel CPUs in this video both cost around $170 to $180 US. Also, because we are using DDR5 memory exclusively for the Intel 12th and 13th gen CPUs, as I feel you really should when building a brand new system, the cheapest LGA 1700 motherboards available supporting DDR5 memory cost $160 US, and that is for a Z690 model. It's $170 for a B670, $190 for a B660, which is a bit odd, and then $200 for a Z790. So let's go with the cheapest Z690 option at $160. For AM5, the cheapest B650 boards are also $160, with X670 priced well north of $200. Then for AM4, you have a mountain of options there, plenty of solid boards for as little as $120 US, so we'll go with that price point. Again, you can also get cheap DDR4 B660 boards for Intel CPUs, but for new system builders looking at spending more than $200 on their CPU, I'm not convinced buying one of those boards at the moment, along with DDR4 memory, would be the right choice. Again, I'd be more inclined to do that with a budget-focused build. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's go over the data. Based on current retail pricing, it'll come as no surprise to learn that the Ryzen 5 5600 offers the best value here, given that it can be had for as little as $135 US. Though stock at this price might be drying up. For example, at the time of creating this video, very few listings were still online, so it's hard to say what the future is for that part. Now, looking at the 7600X, it's interesting to learn that at the current asking price of $250, it actually offers the same value as the 7600, so the non-X version, ignoring the fact that it doesn't come with a cooler. And I do expect the 7600X to increase in price back towards the $300 US MSRP now that the 7600 is available. And of course, we will look at that sort of pricing soon, but for now at least, the 7600 doesn't really change the value proposition. Still, in terms of value, both do slaughter the Core i5 13600K, which currently costs $320 US. Now, you could reduce the cost of the Core i5 build by around $100 with cheaper DDR4 memory on a B660 motherboard, but even if we take the same 221 FPS, which was achieved with more expensive DDR5 memory, that would only place it roughly on par with the 7600 in terms of value, and we know from previous testing that the 3600K is at least 8% slower on average, using more affordable DDR4 memory. So it would seem as though at present, AMD has managed to beat Intel in terms of value for the 7600/7600X versus 13600K battle. Now, the Ryzen 7 7700 is interesting because, again, it is slightly worse value than the 7700X, which is currently selling for just $345 US, but again, could head back towards the MSRP now that the 7700 is on the market. For those of you building a new system, the 7700X makes more sense than any of the 8-core AM4 options, including the 5800X 3D, as you're getting slightly better performance at a similar cost per frame on a newer platform supporting DDR5 memory with just a much better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore everything I just said. The 13700K might be the better option here, depending on your workload. Then we have the 7900, which is a very nice CPU, but also doesn't really make sense for gamers. You're just much better off with a single CCD Ryzen 7 part. And even for productivity, you might as well just get the 7950X or 13900K, though power usage and thermal issues make the Core i9 a lot less practical as a productivity CPU. And while you can tune it for better power consumption and thermals, it does make it slower, while no such compromise is necessary for the 7950X. What's clear to me is Zen's position has certainly been strengthened since our initial reviews. The more affordable 65-watt parts, which are also much more sensible out of the box, coupled with the much cheaper B650 motherboards, means the platform is now viable and, in my opinion, the obvious choice over AM4 for new system builders, outside of budget builds, of course. That said, this was also sort of true before the arrival of these new 65-watt parts, as AMD has aggressively cut prices over the past few months, but these new parts make that pricing official. And there is a good chance that the X parts will head back towards their respective MSRPs, and if they do, pricing will look more like this, and at that point I'd highly recommend you ignore them and just go for the non-X 65-watt models instead. Of course, all of that said, what I'd recommend right now is sticking with my recommendation for the last few months, and that is to do nothing until next month when we get to see what the 3D V-Cache versions of the 7800X 3D, 7900X 3D, and 7950X 3D have to offer. It's not going to be too long now, guys. Those parts should really shake up the market, and they could even force Intel into some aggressive price cuts, so fingers crossed on that one. Oh, and as a side note, I have purchased the Core i3 13100, Core i5 13400, and Core i5 13500. Actually, I also got the Core i7 13700 as well. Intel announced those parts at CES, but For whatever reason, unlike AMD, Intel doesn't sample their locked processors, so we've had to go and purchase them, and they should arrive sometime this week, so hopefully that content won't be too far away. I've also got some new B760 motherboards as well. Probably do some overclocking on those. I've got some that will support that. So anyway, some good content there, so make sure you're subscribed for that. But that is going to do it for this one. If you like the video, do give it a like. We also have Floatplane and Patreon. If you want to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you get access to some pretty cool exclusive stuff. Tim and I get together and do a live stream for you guys, so do that in person, at least Tim and I. What else do? We do Q&As. We have an exclusive Discord server. That is very cool. Great place to hang out and chat. And of course, Tim and I are active there as well as our video editor, Balin. And behind the scenes content. So some cool videos there from time to time. Anyway, pretty cool stuff. Check it out if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.